So when I was 9 years old, I became very involved in politics. The year was 1972. It was a presidential election year, and I had a favorite candidate. Well, one of my fellow fourth graders, he was backing the other guy. And so we decided, in the way of knights of old, we would settle this question ourselves with single combat. During recess, we went out to the sand lot of our California elementary school and decided we would have it out. As I recall, it was much more of a wrestling match than fisticuffs, but I triumphed over my opponent, ensuring that Richard Nixon would have 4 more years as president. I'm sorry, you have me to blame for what followed. But a few years later, I reaped my reward. Sitting in the back seat of our family's Chevy Impala, I listened to the radio broadcaster giving the play-by-play of Nixon's unceremonious helicopter flight away from the White House and ignominiously into history. Now, even with that early disappointment, I continued to be active in politics all the way through college. But eventually I found that the partisanship, the divisiveness of the political world that I was in just didn't sustain me. It didn't provide the values, the qualities of resilience that I needed to continue to be active in trying to create the kind of world that I envisioned. Now, years later, I did find a community and ideology that sustained me, that nourished both my soul and my mind in the practical world of being a parish minister, as well as in the academic world of teaching religion. For me, religion has always been about learning the human stories in all their varieties, understanding how those stories shape our ethics, shape the way we create communities, the values that we embed in our lives. My goal, my opposite shore, to use Florence Chadwick's story as a metaphor, has been to help us to realize the potential that religion has in our traditions to shape that story, to shape our communities, toward creating a world of greater justice and lives of greater wholeness. Now, I have to admit that this choice hasn't always been easy. There were and still are times that I felt frustrated, even hopeless, ready to give it all up. Sometimes it's personal frustrations. Other times it's the morning newspaper, stories from as far away as Syria or as nearby as Indiana, that create so much fog that I have trouble finding that hopeful horizon. But I have found resilience in my quest in the lives of people like Karen Armstrong and Thich Nhat Hanh. They are heroes to me who give me strength. Yet there have been those times at especially low moments where they seem so remote with all their achievements, their books and their wise poetry, that how can I, just a mere mortal, begin to relate to them? Yes, hero worship definitely can have its downside. Yet as I get to know these larger-than-life figures as fellow human beings, as I learn about the core values that have sustained them, that have gave their lives resilience, I find more meaning in the lives they've lived than their often daunting lists of accomplishments. For instance, I can't imagine what it would be like to have the kind of successful career in the academic world as Karen Armstrong has. The wonderful books that she's written, the people that she has inspired, the conversations she's started. Now, my first encounter with her was listening to a book on tape of A History of God, listening during my 50-minute commute from the west side of Minneapolis to my intern church, the Whiteberry UU Church. I find myself arguing with Armstrong, speaking into my steering wheel. Oh, it's a too narrow concept of God that she's talking about. Focus too much on a Western normative model. This was during my great era of theological discussion. Now, I was completely ignoring, that deeper essence of what she was about her theological project, about her examination of this particular form and trying to reveal the multifacetedness of it throughout history. It was only later that I learned of Armstrong's struggle, after I had already idealized this scholar, this amazing writer, and learned about her struggle to get to the God that she mentions in the reading that Linda shared with us. This was a very long road for Armstrong, from the 17-year-old novice and 7 years as a nun to this scholar whose picture appears in the back of so many influential and wonderful books. Armstrong struggled in the convent for 7 years, suffering from panic attacks, periods of amnesia, and fainting spells, to be told that she was suffering from woman things. She was too emotional. She was seeking attention. After leaving the convent and starting her academic career, the attacks continued. But she found friends and doctors who took her illness seriously. Then she was resistant and fearful of the label mental illness. But that resistance ended when there was the unremembered act of washing down a fistful of sleeping pills with a glass of sherry on her 27th birthday. That resulted in a period of hospitalization that Armstrong refers to as a watershed moment in her life. It was not a smooth path from there. She describes her continued life as a roller coaster. But there was another moment, 4.5 years after leaving the convent, and she was reading the words of a T.S. Eliot poet, and she said that those words so resonated with her that she found a fit for her inner and outer voice. She found in her words that if she could gaze unflinchingly at reality, just as it is, with its unpleasantness and its wonderfulness, that then she could learn to rejoice in it. Her continued steps would include academic success and heartache, teaching jobs gained and lost, a diagnosis of epilepsy that brought her a sense of relief and showed her now a definition for her illness. Now, this journey was the origin of her autobiographical book's title, The Spiral Staircase. Her own climb, professional, personal, physical, and spiritual, led Armstrong to see the centrality of compassion expressed in all religious traditions. Rather than this disappointing lack of the being of God that she struggled to try and encounter when she was a nun, or the sense of a universe empty of God that she found when she left cloistered life, the God that ultimately resonated with Armstrong was not a being, but a compassionate encounter with reality as it is, with all its joy and all its pain. Guided by the mystics and the writers of all traditions, she connected with that greater than, not as a transcendent being or ultimacy, but as a transcendence of self, a connection to all. Now, she writes that this spirituality of empathy is not always easy. She still finds her tongue can be awfully sharp and her temper short. But that joyous connection she's found with life has been worth the journey, worth the struggle. And then there's Thich Nhat Hanh, whose Buddhism came of age in a time of war. His personal theology shaped by exile from the land that he loved. And this realization that calling people victims or calling people enemies did nothing to help heal our world or bring anyone closer to happiness. Instead, he focused on the totality of what he describes as our interrelatedness. In his teachings, this understanding of interconnected reality led to that same spirituality as Armstrong's quest for a God in the faiths of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, this spirituality of compassion. In Buddhism, there are really two different dominant ways of reaching this profound truth of interconnectedness, this bone-deep knowledge that we are really empty of difference. And it is our perceptions of those differences that are caused by our own fear, greed, hatred, and desires. In the poem from Thich Nhat Hanh that Linda read for us, he describes this path, this realization, is one that occurs when looking deeply into reality, experiencing that we see it as an object of our perception is really us. Birth, death, life, all of these perceptions are ultimately meaningless as we face this inclusive, non-dualistic, interrelated reality. To hate the other is to hate ourselves. To wage war on the other is to wage war on ourselves. To show compassion to the other is to show compassion for ourselves. This final step, this stage of compassion, that's when true happiness is possible. Thich Nhat Hanh always has that idea of the smile that occurs with that realization. It's this reality, it's this understanding of this deep interrelatedness that gave Thich Nhat Hanh the resilience to decide during the time of war to help his people, to go and rebuild bombed villages, to create schools and hospitals, not caring which side had done the damage or which side the damaged village was on, and to advocate for peace traveling around the world. It was while he was away on one of these peace missions that he was told if he returned to Vietnam, he would be killed. And it was that time that his resilience was most strongly tested. One of his nuns recounts the story of the deep depression that this enlightened being fell into, with this thought that he could never return to the homeland that he so loved. And he faced that angst with a time of deep meditation. And after 6 months, he came out of this, not only with a firm resolve of this idea of interconnection, but an even deeper understanding of what that meant. Saying that the miracle of walking on the earth in Vietnam is no greater, no less than the miracle of walking on the earth in France. The miracle of the child's smile in Vietnam is no greater or less than that smile in France. He found that possibility of happiness was constant in each moment, in each place. And he lives that compassion still today, continuing to challenge me whenever I'm in one of those hopeless moments. These lives, Karen Armstrong, Thich Nhat Hanh, they're important for me, both because they've helped to shape my beliefs, but possibly even more so for me because they speak to that struggle. Too often, I look at those whose work I admire, and I imagine that there's some immaculate conception, not knowing that they too have doubts, they too have pain, they too have suffered illness and setbacks. And their work is not in spite of these experiences, but because of them. They're ultimately optimistic stories, like those of so many of our heroes, are human stories of struggle and of trying. I think possibly one of the most famous optimists in our Unitarian Universalist story has to be Theodore Parker. We will be singing his words at the conclusion of our service, one that speaks to this ideal of what a religious community can be. Now, he's probably most famous for what he said, and this is the extended version, where he said, "Look at the facts of the world. You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and my eyes reach but a little way. But I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine by its conscience, but from what I see, I am sure that it bends toward justice." The arc of the universe bends towards justice. Now, Parker made that statement at a very specific moment in a very specific context. He also said around that time, things refused to be mismanaged long. Jefferson trembled when he thought of slavery and remembered that God is just. Ere long, all America will tremble. In the hindsight of history, we hear his prophetic words as almost a foregone conclusion, thinking, of course it would be so. But Parker did not arrive at those words without a sense of struggle. Both of his parents and all 7 of his siblings had died from tuberculosis before 17-year-old Parker entered Harvard. And to remember at that point, the challenge of slavery was really at a flashpoint in our nation's history. Our nation was tearing itself apart over this struggle, violently tearing itself apart. Parker said that he wrote his sermons with a pistol at his side so that he would be ready to protect his Boston neighbors. As a result of the fugitive slave law that was passed in 1850, which brought slavers from the South into the neighborhoods of Boston, where they would pull African Americans off the streets, selling them into slavery. African Americans, many of whom were parts of families that had been free for generations. And yet, in that context, Parker's own conviction that this universe would bend toward justice led him to speak with such utter confidence. Now, we do have to hope that no matter how bleak our times may seem, that our beloved Reverend Stringer won't feel the need to keep a pistol at his side to protect us. Now, I would have to say that, in my opinion, Parker's analogy of the arc of the universe, maybe it's a bit deceptive. I mean, when you think of an arc, it's this smooth line, right? It goes from point A to point B so smoothly. Yet I have to think that arc is more of a zigzag with its ups and its downs, moving that direction through our great efforts of pulling and tugging at it. There's progress, there's setbacks. We see that both in our world and in our own lives. There are those mornings where I wake up and the messed up nerves in my lower back and the pinched nerves in my neck make me wonder just what it's going to be like when I set that first foot on the ground. And I kind of wish I could just stay in bed all day. Or those days where I look out in my room full of students and more of them are asleep than paying attention. Maybe it's at that moment that a handgun to be handy. That might get their attention. In those moments, yes, I have to admit, I am sometimes prone to cynicism. But that cynicism never really leads me to a deeper sense of genuine happiness. Parker, Armstrong, Thich Nhat Hanh, they all share that ability to ride those ups and downs, both personally and in our larger society. To see that arc, to understand that they are in their moment, but the reality is this change. All 3 of them embrace a spirituality that unites us with all of life. You may remember that I said Buddhism offers 2 paths toward this deeper understanding. Thich Nhat Hanh's being one, that you reach compassion through this realization of this deep interconnectedness. The Dalai Lama offers another one, this idea that begins instead of with that deep connection, just the actions of compassion themselves. As he says, all of us desire to be happy. Money doesn't get us there. Things don't get us there. Those are the illusions that think they do. But on the other hand, acting compassionately does. He goes on to explain that when we act compassionately, we gradually then realize that sense of interconnectedness. And it is that realization that brings that deep, abiding happiness. We could well call this the fake it till you make it approach. Acting in compassion helps us to become compassionate. The compassion increases our ability to hope, to trust, to be happy in this world, both as a community and as individuals. All these qualities give us the tools to face those ups and downs in those ongoing moments of living through that arc of the universe. And they just might be the key to the resilience to get us out of bed on those difficult mornings and to be able to see above the thickest fog and realize that that shore is not too distant to reach. Thank you.